All right, welcome back to El Niño Speaks. Tonight I have on Kyle Matovcik again. He's been a regular to the show and has always provided some much needed insights from a much more nuanced libertarian perspective. How are you doing tonight, Kyle?
Excellent, man. Always happy to be back.
Great stuff, man. So, yeah, let's get started with just like a few weeks into the Trump presidency. What are your general thoughts so far? Because I want to get not just people like in the nationalist movement, all that, but also people that have come from like a more, I would say like conventional libertarian background, but from like definitely a more libertarian leaning background to get your thoughts on Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, I got to say, I was definitely one of the more critical right leaning libertarians about Trump leading up to the election. I didn't vote for him. And if I could go back, I probably still wouldn't change it. But if I'm being honest, I am pleasantly surprised with quite a bit of things. And obviously, there's some things that were par for the course and some things that I think I predicted and got right. But the foreign policy picks, I'm going to say, are pretty abysmal. Mike Waltz being Secretary of what the hell is his position? Not Secretary
National
of State.
Security Advisor or
National
something like
Security
that.
Advisor. I
Yeah.
apologize. Yeah. Mike Waltz being
Yeah.
National Security Advisor, he was one of the people who did the congressional delegations to Ukraine, Taiwan. He was calling for Biden to send more weapons to Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
So pretty much F minus in all the categories above. And then Marco Rubio, who I had initially said would probably be worse than Blinken. It seems not be the case so far. So maybe that was a little hyperbolic on my part. But at the same time, Marco Rubio never saw an intervention, a war, a drone bombing campaign, a coup. He never saw any foreign intervention that he wasn't all giddy about, other than the usual thing that everybody used to say that Ron DeSantis was a neocon, which was voting against regime change in 2013 when it came to Syria. But that was just because that was Obama's regime change war. But every other intervention, Marco Rubio was happy to go all aboard with. And in Trump's first administration, I'm sure you and your listeners are aware of this, but just in case there are any that aren't, he was one of the people that helped engineer the whole Operation Gideon, which was a coup where they sent four troops down to Venezuela and recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, which was a failed coup, but an attempted coup nonetheless.
Yes. Marco Rubio is interesting now. I think that in his case, I think it goes beyond Rubio to start. There is, I believe, an emerging elite consensus in the national security realm that the Russo-Ukraine war is a lost cause. Russia's going to end up winning that, and the extent of its victory is going to be determined really by how much more weapons they shovel into Ukraine, and if Ukraine doesn't even bother to reach any settlements. Like, we could potentially see the absolute destruction of the Ukraine as a modern political entity. That's very much in the cards. But with Rubio, one thing, because you mentioned his first term with Trump, one thing that should be noted about Rubio, and I pointed this out too in one of my recent Substack posts, I've followed Rubio since he came onto the scene in the Tea Party movement in 2010. And one thing about him is he is a very adept politician that knows how to ride a wave. He rode the Tea Party wave pretty well when he was basically just a generic wheeling and dealing Florida politician, neocon type. He rode the Tea Party well. And then he miscalculated during Trump's first run by running like a really generic conservative campaign. But then when Trump came in office, he started embracing this weird type of pseudo-populist style conservatism where he was obviously challenging free trade, China, and all this stuff, but was even questioning some aspects of like capitalism. But the guy knows how to move where the wind's blowing. And I think his foreign policy moves are part of this trend where he's just riding a trend. And one thing to note is I don't think it's a coincidence as well as the world has gotten more multipolar. There is a return to sphere of influence politics. And I think Rubio's regime change shenanigans that he was helping engineer in Venezuela during Trump's first term probably to come back in a second term. In fact, some of the first countries he was visiting were in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is, and I've been arguing this for some time, there may be an elite push. I think this is beyond Trump, but because Trump has floated in the air in a really ham-fisted way, annexing Canada, Greenland, and even Mexico, parts of Mexico and all that, I think that the North American Union is going to be back on deck. Like conspiracy people, they were right. It's just that they were like 30 to 40 years ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
That I think that's what's going to be on the menu. And one final thing,
There.
Rubio sounded Mearsheimer light, John Mearsheimer light the other day when he was saying like the unipolar moment is over. I mean, he was like basically almost 20 years too late, but better late than never, as they say. But yes, there is. I think we are going to see a different foreign policy, but by different, it's not necessarily mean it's good, and it's going to be just different in terms of the direction where it's aiming.
Yeah, so I'm interested to see how this goes because one of Trump's first like Truth Social posts as president was about diplomacy with China, which I think actually is overall a good thing if we can cool tensions there because my biggest thing is no hot war with China. So Trump coming in and seeming to take more of a diplomatic approach where it seems like he's more willing to work with China this time around, I think is a good thing. But kind of to tap onto the Rubio point there, I think you're right that he is pretty adept at kind of feeling which way the wind's blowing. And that's why initially he was all about, sending aid to Ukraine until I want to say it was probably like maybe early to mid 2024 when he really started to change his tune. And then now, like you said, he sounds a lot more Mearsheimer light where he's realizing that, oh, no, the world's going to be multipolar, whether we like it or not. Like China was a superpower once before. They went through the century of humiliation and all this other stuff. They were in really bad shape, and that's not to say they're in necessarily excellent shape now, but they're definitely doing better and better and better. Like their economic growth started to taper off a little bit, but they're still going to expand over in their region of the world and specifically over in Africa and stuff like that. And if the U.S. doesn't start to wise up, then they're going to continue to build trade alliances down South America. But I think Rubio is just feeling that that's the way that the administration is going, that they don't want to keep fighting in Ukraine. But I don't think Trump is going to have the finesse to be able to pull this off because, as I think you and I have discussed before, Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz, and even Rubio himself, they don't really have a good plan for how to deal with Ukraine. And their explicit plan so far is to do the exact same thing that Biden did, which is send more weapons, use more sanctions, use tariffs. Like we've already tried that for the last 2 years. And what has it got us? It got us hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians, dead Russians, and then probably the same result that was always going to happen. And that's pretty much Russia taking parts of Ukraine, either that or completely eliminating Ukraine, or maybe the other potential of this kind of leading to a frozen conflict where the U.S. sends a little bit of money and weapons every here and there. And that just drags on for a certain period until they finally decide to, one side decides to call it quits. And the side that's going to call it quits, in my opinion, is probably going to be Ukraine.
Yes, that's where I think it's going. I think that there is a small chance that if negotiations just fall through, Trump might send like a final batch of aid, but they might just kick that conflict off to the Europeans because I think there is a kind of Trump scheme where they are, I think the Greenland annexation threats is like a veiled threat to NATO to boost their defense spending. Which really, when you look at increasing NATO defense spending, it sounds like a good idea on paper, but there's a corporate ploy to it because most of NATO countries, they buy all most of the bulk of their weapons from the U.S. and it's a good way to keep U.S. defense contractors humming.
Right.
And I also think too that a lot of these countries, if we're being brutally honest, like for Spain and France, like Russia is not like an existential threat whatsoever. There's like really no need for them to be like boosting the spending. Like for the Baltic states and Poland, that's a different story. But I actually hope that in a really accelerationist way that these Greenland talks intensify so that it actually like destroys NATO from within. Like that's what I'm hoping for.
No, I like that perspective a lot, and I really haven't considered that because for the most part, I've looked at like this whole annexation talk as mostly like a meme. I had a friend of mine, a personal friend of mine who knows me and knows that I'm a big anti-interventionist, was saying to me like, oh, well, what about all this annexation talk? I'm like, look, like I'm against it in principle, but it seems like a meme. Like, I'm not taking this seriously. But I mean, if it does become a legit thing, like, all right, I think all the people in our sphere would agree. I think we have bigger issues on our plate. Let's fix shit here at home before we start thinking about adding all these territories, especially like Canada. Like, they fucking deleted Trudeau, dude. We don't want here. Like,
Hell no. We don't want any more of those Bajeets too there.
well, yeah, exactly. And I'm sure you know who Ryan Stone is, but he talks about this all the time.
Yeah, he's funny.
Oh yeah, he's great. I was just talking to him yesterday actually on Rule Zero afterwards. And he was like, yeah, women like don't go out anymore because like in all the major cities, it's just all Indians everywhere. And some women honestly don't feel safe anymore. So yeah, like if we annex Canada, despite how many people we export out of here, we're just pretty much annexing all those people back in. And then we're also bringing pretty much a cold California on top of us.
Yeah. It'd be like a more interesting prospect if it would be if we got like the western prairie provinces of Canada, like Alberta and those areas. But if you include like all of it, like from Ontario and all those other parts, or even like British Columbia, you basically got like a big leftist constituency that's increasingly becoming non-white to boot. And actually, what's even worse, I've argued this too. Canada is a really bad sneak preview of something I've been warning about a second Trump administration potentially ushering in of so-called skilled migration, which is really legal migration of like striver class, like immigrants and even like scammers, outright scam type immigrant people who just come here illegally and depress wages and even become a overclass, like a new like elite. Unlike, say, like illegal Mexican labor or whatever, like I don't want them either. But with those types, there's no real potential for those people to ever become like an overclass. But when you bring in all these so-called skilled laborers, you get like Vivek Ramaswamy and other striver class and like flat out scammer types coming in.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny. And I think you were probably able to see this too, because a lot of people I think were so sniffing their own farts, as I say, when it came to Trump winning the election, that they weren't really diligently watching all the moves and everything that everyone was saying. Trump essentially took the same position as Vivek and Elon, and nobody knocked him for it. There were a few people that were like, no, that's bad, but he really did take the same position. Now, he didn't take the same cultural position, but when it came to the whole immigration issue, he did take that same exact position of, we want a ton of skilled people to come here. And you say probably like a year or two ago, I probably would have been all about that. But then thanks to probably you, Hawk, Orrin McIntyre, and some of you guys who are a little bit more right-leaning, I changed my mind over time. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, wait, first of all, why do we want these people? And then second of all, if they're so talented, why can't they make their own country great?
Exactly.
Big question.
That's the strongest argument actually against mass legal immigration. If these people are so valuable, why aren't their countries actually developed and all of that? But yes, I've warned about this for years, actually, that a successful populist movement can't be fully top down in the sense that it cannot just focus on the presidency. You not only have to have good staff, you have to have good House members and Senate members as well. You have to have the votes. I come from this angle, from like the angle of I was working as formerly as a lobbyist at the state level, where we try to pass constitutional carry in red states, and now it's become like the standard. But in the embryonic stages of this, just because you had a trifecta of Republicans in a state government does not guarantee that they will pass a legislation. You have to know who are like the sellouts and who are the real ones and filter out. You have to have a vote count. Like you have to have a quantifiable vote count. You can't just assume it. That's the problem I see with the Trump movement now, is that there's too much assuming and not enough evidence gathering to see who's actually on your side and if there's actually the votes that you need to make this stuff happen. Because with Trump's executive orders as well, which I generally agree with the spirit of like nearly all of them, minus that stupid anti-Semitism thing, a lot of that stuff could get knocked out in the courts, like through the federal courts or even the Supreme Court, because on some of those issues, the Supreme Court can be very iffy when you have people like John Roberts and even like Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett. It's just, you can't assume. You have to know who's on your side, and also realize that you can't always trust, especially the Republican Party, which has multiple decades of selling out their constituents, whether it's the Reagan Revolution, where they wanted to lower the size of government, and Reagan presided over like an enormous increase of it, or Bush administration and other movements. There's always this cycle of euphoria and then disappointment once the governing starts.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm waiting for as well. And I was incorrect about what Trump would do when he first got in. When he first got in, I assumed it was just going to be the status quo. And I completely agree with you that, like, the spirit of all these executive orders, I'm like, wow, this is actually pretty fucking good. Like, I dig a lot of what he's doing. And this comes from somebody who I was going hard against Trump leading up to him getting elected. But now this presents the problem of, much like you said, is he going to be willing to fight this out in the courts? Is this all going to get struck down, and are we going to be disappointed? If past performance is any indicator, yes, we're going to be very disappointed. But at the same time, I think, and I've made this point plenty of times before, but Trump is the Republican establishment now, where, like, you see Marco Rubio, I don't think anybody voted against Marco Rubio, and Mike Waltz. Well, Mike Waltz,
no, it's crazy. I mean, even Bernie voted against Marco Rubio.
Exactly. That's what I mean. So, and this kind of gets to a larger point that I've also made as well. And it doesn't seem like a lot of people seem to get it, but I'm sure you would. I don't think a lot of people are bending the knee to Trump. I think it's just the fact that MAGA means nothing anymore. Like, it's so wide. There's such a wide net, a wide umbrella, that anybody now feels welcome to go in and just say, oh, look, I'm MAGA now because I threw on a Trump hat and I no longer, like, these leftists are too crazy. This is where we're at, because, like, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, all these people are drastically, they're not even close to the same, but they still get all embraced by MAGA. Fuck, even John Fetterman, who was against a bill that would make sure doctors have to give care to children that lived after an abortion. He made sure to vote against that. And these fucking MAGA chuds can't get on his dick fast enough. He said some good stuff about Israel and then about having a controlled border. What the hell's wrong with you guys? So I don't think it's a lot of people bending the knee. I just think it's the fact that MAGA is so meaningless anymore that people feel like they can just swoop in under the tent and be welcomed and no one's going to criticize them for it.
I remember this was 2019 or 2020. There was a Davos meeting where there was like a panel. They were talking about Trump, and they said, despite a lot of Trump's bluster and just bloviating, that he's actually quite predictable and controllable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a precursor to something that a certain degree of the political establishment was not going to, like, revolt if Trump were to have won in 2020. And obviously they didn't revolt in 2024. I think October 7th further confirmed that, to be honest. Because I agree with Academic Asia that there was a regime, there's no vibe shift. There is a regime shift where the regime finally just said, we can make do with Trump because he'll probably be out. He will be out of office after his second term. And he may be a lame duck too, because if we look at one of the most consistent trends in politics is, like, the first midterm in a presidency ends up with the opposing party picking up seats, not outright taking over one of the houses. And if one of the chambers goes down, say like the House, like the Democrats take back the House, Trump's agenda is pretty much DOA for the rest of his presidency. You'll have to do like executive orders, which could be potentially rescinded.
Yeah, and I could foresee that happening as well. So our mutual friend Hawk said that, like, a lot of these issues do come down to will. And right now, because Trump has, and I hate when people say this, but he has this mandate, quote unquote, which, like, I'm not quite seeing it. There was an electoral blowout, but he only got 2 million more votes than Kamala. And much to another point you brought up, I really don't believe the 2020 election was stolen. I believe that they rigged it against him in the media, and people's perceptions were completely distorted by the way that the media played the game. But I don't think there was any, like, switching votes or anything like that, because why? I mean, people's lives were objectively horrible in 2020. And then really, when you look at the big picture for Trump, losing in 2020 was one of the best things that could have happened to his political career, because he would have had to tangle with inflation. He would have had to tangle with October 7th. He would have had to tangle with the Ukraine war. And despite what people think, yeah, I think that's still what happened, because I did a whole podcast on this where he sanctioned the shit out of Russia. He was the first one to send Javelin anti-tank missiles into Ukraine, which Obama, exactly, Obama and Biden would not do, because they were too scared of the tensions that the hell they would raise for it. So Trump would have had to tangle with all of that if he would have been reelected in 2020. So really, him losing, he got to rightfully blame that all on the Democrats, because obviously anybody with a brain will say and should say that the Democrats are rightfully to blame for a lot of these issues. But Trump has a lot of complicity in these issues, and he got to skate by all of that. And then now, the ceasefire in Gaza is good. I mean, I didn't expect that at all. That really came out of left field. And especially, I did laugh about Koff when he went over there. They tried to shoo him away by saying Saturday is the Sabbath. He said, I don't give a shit about your Sabbath.
Yeah.
And he went in and got the ceasefire done. But I'm sure if you keep up with Dave DeCamp, and if the listeners keep up with Dave DeCamp, they still did kill a few Palestinians afterwards. And then they did continue to aggress in the West Bank. But as was per usual, I think that was the deal where we'll just continue to throw the Palestinians under the bus. We'll get a ceasefire because it looks good, and because it was already on paper. All somebody had to do was basically just get Benjamin Netanyahu to back down. Yeah. But we'll give him the West Bank instead.
I read some more nuanced takes at a lot of this is from this magazine called 972. It's actually an Israeli magazine that's more leftist, but it's actually, I think it's way better than Haaretz, for example.
Okay.
They argued pretty convincingly that Trump had an impact, but really it was Netanyahu's domestic situation, because the Gaza conflict, it not only has racked up more casualties than a lot of Western media is reporting for the Israelis, but it's also, the hostage situation was creating a major anti-war movement in Israel that was actually generating strikes, like threats of strikes. And it was coming to the point where Netanyahu's coalition was basically falling apart. There was like some projections where, had he continued the conflict to the present, no ceasefire, his government would have likely had collapsed because of just the increasing pressure. And there's also a lot of centripetal forces as well at play with the extreme hard right Jews that want to be exempt from obligatory military service. And then you have like the wackos like that Itamar Ben-Gvir type that basically wants to just genocide all Palestinians. He left the government actually after the ceasefire. Right. Yeah, this magazine argues pretty convincingly that this was largely Netanyahu's call right now, that the Gaza conflict was starting to become a political liability, because the rally around the flag effect, that was only there for maybe 3 to 4 months after October 7th. But once like more the Israelis started taking more casualties and more hostages were taken, and none of them were getting released, and some were just like flat out getting killed, the public has really lost their trust in that government. And I wouldn't be shocked if his government collapses in the next few months.
Yeah, I've heard that quite a bit. And obviously Netanyahu was very unpopular prior to October 7th. But like you said, the rally around the flag effect had really boosted him up. But though, I think after, by all accounts, it seems to be like Netanyahu let this happen, because I know there's just another article recently where they said it was like 3 or 4 women in the IDF had said, hey, they're doing some sketchy drills right outside our borders here, like something's going on. And they had foreknowledge. Even Egypt had told Netanyahu that, hey, something's going to happen. And they continually just dismissed it. And then obviously October 7th happened. And then now, even by more accounts, they said themselves in the Times of Israel, and I think even Haaretz reported this, that they used the Hannibal Directive. It's hard right after that to still tell your people, like, hey, I got your best interest in mind, even though I purposefully killed some of your brothers and sisters, even though I had knowledge of this and I let it happen, I'm still here for you guys. And then, you know what? He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel. it's hard to convince the public, even though we all know that Jews are very nepotistic and have a very, very strong in-group preference. Eventually, they're probably going to realize, like, all right, you can't pull the wool over our eyes forever. Something needs to happen. And like you said, Ben Gvir had just left, but some of the Knesset, if I remember correctly, is more right wing than Netanyahu. Like they want the IDF to go way harder, but he's a moderate compared to some of those others underneath him.
I think you mentioned West Bank, and this also ties back to October 7th. One of the reasons why I think the Netanyahu types let it happen, or they weren't really prepared for October 7th, is contrary to popular belief, the Israelis have more of a fixation with occupying the West Bank than Gaza. Because West Bank is the Judea and Samaria. That's like the biblical Israel that a lot of these wackos on the religious nationalists want. And that's what, honestly, why Miriam Adelson cut that fat check to Trump, because I think they want the West Bank occupation. So they left their eyes off of Gaza and instead focused more on West Bank and also threats from Hezbollah and the Axis of Resistance. So they got pretty much blindsided there. But I think now the threat against the Palestinians is going to come through the West Bank and these talks of expulsion from Gaza. But I do think it's going to be a renewed offensive. And what I believe Trump is likely to deliver is like some recognition of West Bank settlements, because this is another thing too. And I really don't defend Trump a lot on foreign policy, but in his first administration, he tempered some of those settlements, but in a really calculated way, saying, hey, lay off these settlements for now. Let's wait for a more opportune moment to do that. But I think now that stuff could be very much on the menu, because Trump is like a master of the bait and switch.
Yeah. And much to your point, I think, and a lot of the anti-war guys as well seem to think this as well, where basically like he may extend that ceasefire in Gaza or may be able to get that to wind down, but it's going to be at the expense of the West Bank, as in he's just going to let them do whatever they want over there. But hey, maybe cool in Gaza. But at the same time, the only pressure that Biden never really did was withholding 2,000-pound bombs, which Trump now just, I think this past week, decided you can start shipping more 2,000-pound bombs over to Israel. So yeah, I think what you said is probably going to happen. It's probably going to be more expansion over the West Bank. And if I remember correctly, it was what the general's plan or something like that was, where they wanted to go for the Greater Israel Project. That was something that was floated out over the summer, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think the Gaza situation, that's going to probably be a ceasefire. You both tend to forget this, that Israel had to unilaterally withdraw from there. And it's just a hornet's nest. And it's more likely they're going to do stuff in the West Bank. But there's some stuff that can really pop off there, because they have a puppet government in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority. Mm-hmm. And some of the policies the Trump administration has done is like the reversing of the sanctions on those Israeli settlers and people associated with Israeli like settler units. That's historically the sanctioning of the settlers by the U.S. is a carrot that U.S. has used to get the Palestinian Authority to play ball. But when you get rid of that carrot, man, the whole point of the Palestinian Authority's existence is just no longer there. And that opens up the door for the West Bank to become radicalized and get taken over by Hamas, which is one of the ironies here.
Yeah, well, on Anthony Blinken's way out, I'm pretty sure he said that like Hamas is pretty much just as big and bad as they were on October 7th, and that despite how many people they killed, and I know there have been some estimates where like the official body count now is like about 43,000, 44,000 or something like that. The official counts of like dead and wounded by some estimates, I can't remember who exactly gave the estimates, but they said it's like 180 to 200,000 people.
I've heard it's higher for some people. I've heard it's like the Lancet source.
That's it. Yeah.
I've heard from them, and I don't think it's direct combat. I've heard that some of the death toll is close to 500,000 when you factor in like famine and other like the winter conditions. We really don't know, but it isn't the first live streamed ethnic cleansing / genocide that we've seen in like the 21st century. And it's horrendous.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the Israelis are acting completely barbaric, and the people who defend it, it's astounding to me. Yeah, they are absolute barbarians there. And then
ritual murder.
Yeah, well, and then literally debating the ethics of rape in court. And of course, what was the big claim on October 7th? They beheaded babies and there were mass rapes. Okay, well, then you find out that the person who spread the lie about the beheaded babies, he works for some like Israeli media firm, if I remember correctly. Max Blumenthal had talked all about this. And then obviously there's no evidence of beheaded babies. And then they literally in the courts in Israel were debating the ethics of raping people. I mean, you could find videos of Israeli soldiers gathered around a Palestinian man as they shove a bayonet in the fucking dude's ass. Like, they're absolute savages over there. Believe that the Palestinians, and I'm sure there's some awful Palestinians and awful people who are in Hamas, but just because Israel has high technology doesn't mean that they're somehow above this shit. I mean, if you ask me, high-tech barbarism is probably a lot worse than low-tech barbarism because they still act like fucking animals over there. So
the backing of Uncle Sambo Steen as well. So,
well, yeah, and exactly. And then Trump's big thing recently, and it's almost hard to nail him down on anything because he says so much. It almost does make sense, though. Like, I could see a through line here with the whole Abraham's Accords deal, where, funny enough, we didn't cut off aid. Well, the whole executive order with ending all foreign aid. My understanding is it didn't include Ukraine, it didn't include Israel, it didn't include Cairo, and it didn't include Egypt. And funny enough, what does Trump say right after all these executive orders? Oh, well, we should probably try to ethnically cleanse Gaza and put 1.5 million Palestinians into Egypt. Now, well, funny enough, they're still getting foreign aid. So once again, what was Abraham Accords about? Paying off dictators to ignore the Palestinians.
Yeah. With regards to Egypt, arguably the aid it receives, you can almost tack that in with Israel aid, because it's basically a bribe to get the Egyptians not to fight the Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
I would even argue that the military assistance that Turkey receives as part of being part of NATO, and some of the money it receives in the U.S. and defense cooperation with the U.S. is also part of an agreement to also not fight Israel. Like, the U.S. has to straight up bribe countries in the Middle East to do so, to not fight Israel. That's what the Abraham Accords are. That whole Palestinian expulsion thing, that's going to have some really nasty blowback if it happens, because not only will it like potentially topple like the Jordanians or Egyptians that they receive all those Palestinians, they also will allow for really disaffected Palestinian groups to use those countries as like launch pads for attacks. Because I remember there was like the Palestinians who went to Kuwait in like late 80s and like 90s. They launched attacks against Israel, like rocket attacks there, because they'll just having a disgruntled population with an axe to grind. Like, you're always gonna have that issue. And that's why a lot of these conservatives like say, oh, why aren't these Muslim countries taking in Palestinians? And it's like, this is like their land. Like, you just can't negotiate. Like, real estate is finite. Like, there ain't nobody building any more of it, as they say. And people will fight to the death over it. And B, most countries don't want to basically have a potential fifth column of Palestinian militants with an axe grind to launch attacks from their country and invite like reprisals from like the Israelis. Like, they don't want that. Like, they want them to be there. Like, none of these countries want to ultimately be complicit in allowing the Israelis to ethnically cleanse Palestine, which also will open up those countries like to terror attacks from like Islamic militants that sympathize with the Palestinians. So it's a hot potato issue that none of those countries want. They want Israel to just deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, that really opens it up to a big liability, because Israel has a lot of firepower, but they can only fight so much. But at the same time, if you got out now, let's say they split it in the middle and then 750,000 Palestinians go to wherever, Kuwait, Turkey, and then the other go to Egypt. Like, now you have this huge mass of people who, like you said, have an axe to grind, and now basically are putting a target on your country's back because they want to go fuck with Israel because they didn't want to be ethnically cleansed from their land. When, once again, and even if you put 750,000 Palestinians over here, I wouldn't want those people here. They're a bunch of third.
No, I don't either.
Yeah, and I feel for them. I don't want them to be ethnically cleansed, but that's not my fucking problem. And the Egyptians and everybody else, all their neighbors have a right to feel that same way. But, really, who's the problem in this whole situation? The same people that got thrown out of 100 areas in over 1,000 cities.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I'd rather the Palestinians be in Palestine fighting for their lands than being like absorbed into the consumer blob that is now. I'd rather if you're like an actual nationalist, you want the Palestinians to be in their countries, in their country fighting off like Israelis and all that because like they're gonna have to bribe the Palestinians. Because a lot of these Palestinians, for them, I've been telling people for this because people have very economically reductionist views of like conflict and everything. A lot of things go beyond money. Like a Palestinian that has lived in like a certain area of say like Gaza or the West Bank for multiple generations is going to fight for that regardless of his income or if that place is a piece of shit or not. And in fact, there's actually there was at one point what it was like the Ottoman controlled Palestine where it was actually quite developed, contrary to a lot of neocon and Zionist propaganda. But regardless, for people, regardless of their economic station or whatever, it's their land. And people they will fight to the death over it. And you can't just bribe. In fact, actually, this is something too the Israelis found out the hard way, that despite offering a lot of workers in Gaza these work permits to work in Israel and make money and improve their livelihood, that's so that it prevent them from launching an attack against Israel. So some things go beyond cash.
Yeah, and much to your point, I think if you ask anybody, if you ask me to move out of my house right now, or you're going to take it by force, I'd feel some kind of way about that. I want to give up my house or my home. My family's lived here in southwestern Pennsylvania for, I think, 3 or 4. Yeah, I'd be the 4th generation. So if you're telling me I can't live in Pennsylvania anymore, like I do want to move to Florida, don't get me wrong, but my family's here. I have a whole network here. And especially if you survived conflict, your parents survived conflict to stay in Gaza or the West Bank, you're going to feel a little bit more attached to that place because now you have a stake and you have history here and you don't want to be known as the one who fled. So yeah, I can understand why these people don't want to leave. But, once again, I don't know the correct solution to that whole deal, but, obviously the recalcitrant child in that region is the Israelis because they're the ones that can't seem to fucking get along with anybody else. And once again, I'm not saying that all their neighbors are perfect angels, but, let's face it, Israelis are odd ones out there in that whole situation. So if that means you guys got to leave, you got to go to find somewhere where you're a little bit more accepted and a little bit more peaceful. And where that is, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would have said before two-state solution, but that's become a pipe dream. I've studied Israel-Palestine situation more intensively because there's just too many Israeli settlements all over Palestine now that I think, honestly, the Palestinians could wait this and fight this one out because the Israeli state has so many contradictions now and this large ultra-Orthodox population that is getting on the dole, and just like the nature of Jewish societies always being plagued by infighting that takes them down, the whole 80-year curse. I actually would not be surprised if in our lifetime that like the modern Israeli state as we know it just collapses, and from whatever emerges in the ashes, that's what the Palestinians will probably inherit. So that's like another reason why a lot of those Palestinians, they're digging in because they see this as part of a protracted struggle.
Yeah, actually, to your point, it has been 1947. Yeah, so we're getting pretty close to that 80 years. Now, obviously, I'm not familiar enough with kind of the history of all that to really put a fine number on that. But I mean, if it is 80 years, then much to your point, it does look like they're reaching that point where they're overextending themselves. And obviously, with all the assassinations of the Iranian officials and the poisonings, and I know they never take credit for it, but, Syria fighting Hezbollah, there's only so much you could do until, and I think like the next generation of Americans, I don't think they're really going to tolerate all the same foreign aid because like my dad and my bass player, I look at them as like your barometer of like your average kind of MAGA guy, right? And like, they're not complete and total Trump retards, but like they still have their wits about them, but I can feel where the base is. And obviously, like my coworkers that I work with in the auto business, I can feel where they're at. And I think they're starting to ask the questions. Like my dad's a little bit more, I don't want to say anti-Israeli, but I remember I was doing a Sunday coffee podcast for one time, and he said, "Oh, we had Israeli students in my Matovcik school." He was like, they were different. Like he didn't say good or bad, but the vibe I got from him is that he was like, yeah, these people didn't share our values. So, but then even like my bass player, they're both 55, right? They're both kind of like, fuck Israel. Like, we don't want to fund them anymore. And definitely people our age are like, we don't want anything to do with Israel. So like your Charlie Kirk types, they're definitely the minority, but the problem is that minority, it's the elite theory in action, really, is that it's not bottom up, it's always top down. It's the elites that kind of move shit and dictate where it's going to go.
Yeah, I think like that whole issue is going to be sorted out in time. I want to go back to the tariffs part, because in my previous libertarian days, I would just be like throwing a fit about that. But now I'm much more of a nationalist, and I honestly don't think it's like the end of the world. There's going to obviously come a cost with these tariffs. But as I've said before, in all things being equal, the reason why people appeal to the Gilded Age of the era when tariffs were high is that there's the nuance that there was no regulatory state and like fiat money at that time. And that's why how the US was able to like deal with tariff. But now we're like in the context of a massive managerial state, fiat money, massive spending, lots of regulation. So I can see like partially why some libertarians would bitch about that whole tariff deal that Trump has done by imposing tariffs on Mexico and Canada. But at the same time, I really don't care that much, because a lot of these goods that are getting hit with tariffs, like perhaps like the US needs to like economically struggle a bit. Perhaps people need to tighten their belt and stop consuming stuff and actually start building stuff on their own. And we need to start building our own manufacturing base. I will add too that the tariffs will be a magical thing because we have hollowed out industry here, and also we just have a stupider workforce because of the competency crisis, the DI hires, and just the all idiocratic type of turn our society has gone through in the last few decades, where everybody's just dumber. So a lot going on there. But what are your general thoughts on these tariffs?
Yeah, so to start from where you were there, is that, yeah, in principle, I disagree with the tariffs, because ultimately the costs are going to fall on the consumers. In my mind, the optimal way to go, and I think Trump could be the guy to sell this too, is just give massive, massive tax breaks. And honestly, I wouldn't even be entirely opposed to government grants for people who are like, hey, we're going to build American manufacturing. Yeah. I mean, like, dude, I am a huge, to paint this picture perfectly clear, my family is all General Motors. My wife will never drive a foreign car, as in like one that isn't a General Motors. I've worked for GM for over 10 years. My grandfather, he owned 14 Corvettes. My dad has my Uncle Bob's last Corvette. His dad's last Corvette. My dad is all about GM. I'm all about GM. My older brother's all about General Motors. We love American manufacturing, and GM is, if I remember correctly, actually the most like American-made manufactured car today. Like the Corvette and a lot of the V-bodies, so like your Acadias, Enclaves, and stuff like that, they're still like 70% plus all made here in America. So I'm all about American manufacturing. In my mind, we're putting the cart before the horse. You're putting tariffs on stuff when we don't have a manufacturing base. And like a lot of the reason why China does a lot of this stuff is because they have the manufacturing base. And honestly, they do have some of the talent over there to do a lot of this manufacturing. And I always make this comparison because I love to learn about China. This has been one of my focuses over the last 2 years. China became a lot more like the US used to be, and we became a lot more like what China used to be. We need to get rid of regulations, red tape, and really encourage manufacturing here at home. But at the same time, if the tariffs do encourage more consumption at home, if we're going to be consuming like we are, I think that's a good thing. But like you said, it's also probably a good idea that people tighten up their belts, start to learn to save, because once again, that's the foundation of economic growth is people being able to save and then delay gratification to spend later on or to invest in opportunity and economic growth. And you see this kind of through Jerome Powell, who's been a decent Fed chair, who basically said, fuck the EU and got America, the dollar basically working for America again. I think that's a good thing, but like you said, I think everybody realized that there's going to be some growing pains in this as well.
Yeah, honestly, I would absolutely like trade off like people's Uber Eats just becoming like 2000% more expensive. If it means that a guy in West Virginia can support his family with a manufacturing job, or like any person in the Rust Belt, because the people that are bitching about a lot of these price hikes, they aren't like the poor people. It's mostly these upper middle class, like managerial types that think they're like rich and they think they're aristocrats and they think that they like are entitled to have some immigrant giving them cheap DoorDash or mowing their lawn or performing other services on the cheap. But like in reality is they're living in this clown world economy that's really like a coyote versus roadrunner economy, like when they're going off the cliff. The coyotes going off the cliff. And the reality is that's what globalization has created. It's created an economic illusion. And now that like this illusion is falling apart, these people need to just sober up and actually learn also how to like collectively tighten their belt and work for a much higher purpose.
Yeah, you know what? I completely agree. And I think this kind of goes to the foundations of Austrian economics, where we've had low interest rates for so long that our economy.
Yeah, it's true. That too.
Yeah. Our economics and the economic situation is so distorted where so many people are just working useless jobs. And actually, I'll give Trump another thumbs up for making people go back to work. Because how many bureaucrats are out there right now making a 6-figure salary, which are way more than your average American, right? Your average American, I just looked this up a couple weeks ago, but like your average American salary is like $62,000 a year. The median household income is 88 grand a year. Now, obviously, there's a lot of nuance in here where you live and all that stuff, but
they do nothing.
Exactly. These bureaucrats are getting 6-figure salaries for not even going into the office. And you know what? No, it's time that like Americans learn to actually produce things again and actually do work that is actually like productive and can benefit our own country. And then on top of that, people actually getting an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. The blue collar thing, I did a whole other tweet on this where like that stupid motherfucker, Ian Miles Chong, said, you can make 6 figures a year being in the trades. And I went like all the trade jobs I could possibly think of. Like the highest paid one on average was like $58,000 a year. Now, once again, I'm a tradesperson. I make way more than 58 grand a year. But that being said, I'm not the average guy either. Fully EV certified. I just replaced the battery on an electric Hummer this past week. So I'm not the average blue collar guy, but the average blue collar guy, he ain't making a fucking killing out here. But, you know, honestly, I think he should. I think he should be paid better. And I think this goes back to why I changed my mind on immigration is that, no, we don't need any more immigrants, legal or illegal, coming into the country and distorting the economic situation anymore until the average blue collar worker feels like he can comfortably feed and afford a family, because that's where a lot of people are right now. They're saying, I'm not having kids because I cannot do it economically. It makes zero economic sense for me to have kids. So you know what? Fuck all the immigrants that want to come here. Let's fucking have Americans for America for Americans again.
Yeah. Yeah, this goes back to like the point I mentioned that in a globalized economy, telling people to go to the trades is actually pretty dumb. But in this new nationalist economy, I actually do think trades could be lucrative because of the fact that you will now have more jobs reshoring, hopefully a tighter labor market too, because of immigration restriction. And when you have those factors, those type of jobs, the wages naturally rise, and there's no like depressive forces at play any longer, or distortions where you have all these weird government jobs and just like unproductive nonprofit jobs that are basically getting subsidized through direct government benefits, or even just like preferential interest rates and just easy money. That parade's coming to drastic halt.
Yeah, I really hope so as well, because it's so fucked up to think that there's so many people that are working from home and probably making way better money than your average person. And they're the ones, like you said, bitching about the tariffs and stuff like that. When it's no, when these tariffs come, they're probably going to hurt the average guy. But, hopefully in the long run, they work out for your average guy, because he's going to be able to. And I mean, I live in a steel mill town. Like, I could literally go outside my house and look down over the hill and see the steel mill. Where I grew up in Brackenridge, there was a big old steel mill right on the end of the like 2-3 blocks that I lived on. Transmission shops and shit like that everywhere. I mean, you drive all over Pennsylvania and there's so many factories that are just empty right now. And also, it's not all entirely like just tariffs are going to bring this back. There's also, like you and I have said, a lot of regulations and stuff like that that kind of put the boot on people's necks. And then also a lot of union people and unions where people would go on strike, and then they were generally well off, but they keep wanting more and more and more. And then eventually they said, all right, fuck you, we're done. So fuck unions too, man.
Yeah, I used to be pro-union because they used to be a good force against mass migration, but they're useless on that now. They've stopped opposing, because there was once a time when the labor left opposed mass migration on wage grounds, but now they see mass migration as like a way to like recruit new members, which is a self-defeating thing, because when you increase the freaking labor pool, like, you effectively create conditions to bring in a bunch of scab labor, and you basically strike break yourself. So yeah, it's an antiquated institution. Yeah, I think really when you look at it, the U.S. doesn't have like an industrial policy. It has a post-industrial policy. And that's why a lot of the blue collar people, they get stuck on the short end of the stick. But I'm confident that the next generation of people are going to get rid of these dogmas that have just clouded the judgment of the leadership class.
Yeah, well, let's hope so, because like I said, I am a fourth generation mechanic, and there are just so many good people in the trades. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but the small business owners here in Pennsylvania and all the technicians I've worked with here in Pennsylvania and in Ohio are very honest and good people. And
yeah, they are.
This is the same case for electricians. My stepdad's an electrician, tons of family friends who are plumbers and HVAC techs and stuff like that. Like, these people deserve better conditions than they're getting. And I know this sounds super lefty and socialist, but I want these guys to feel like they can afford to have a family and be happy and feel like America is what it used to be. But we could put a lot of blame on the boomers, but at the same time, they just did what was in their self-interest. And then over time, now that comes down on next generations, and they're fucked. Hopefully dealing with immigration also lowers housing prices and also fix the housing market for a lot of people, because I'm looking at people younger than us, probably that are in their late teens, early 20s. And I'm like, you guys may never own a house if shit keeps going the way that it's going, because I mean, It is brutal out there. I mean, I wanted to move to Tallahassee a couple of years ago, and it was like $200,000 for a little shithole down somewhere in Tallahassee. It would have been 45 minutes away from where I had to work. And it's like, all right, well, houses here in Pennsylvania are affordable, but like, the problem with that is you don't get to leave. If you sell your house, you don't get shit for it. So hopefully that shit starts to settle. The average guy feels like he can finally get ahead. That's what I'm hoping for, but we may be another couple decades away from that, but we don't know.
All right, man. I think this is a good place to wrap things up. But before we leave, let my audience know what you're up to lately.
For sure, Jose. Well, as always, I appreciate you having me on, man. And whenever this airs, people, make sure you go over, check out my podcast feed. You'll find a lot of friendly faces there. Jose's been a guest on the show. I just had Orrin McIntyre on, Samuel Urban. Red Hawk was on a couple months ago, and then Buck Johnson as well. So a ton of like more right-leaning people. I have some cool guests planned for this month, but then obviously my band as well, A Common Crown. We're playing a whole bunch of shows in the southwestern Pennsylvania area and surrounding. A ton of cool opening shows that we're going to be doing. So really looking forward to that. Obviously 5 till midnight. You've been a guest on that show as well, where we just talk shit about current events. And I am most active on Twitter at Kyle Matovcik. Last name is spelled Matovcik, where you can get me talking shit on just about everything and everyone, but then occasionally get some health and foreign policy insights as well.
Thank you, man, for coming on. It's always a pleasure chatting with you. Lots of great insights are shared every time we chat.
For sure, man. Feelings mutual. And now let's do it again soon.
For sure. And to my audience, again, thank you for your attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.